Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something that's pretty crucial, really, for anyone who has to make decisions under pressure, especially given your line of work. We're cracking open Carl von Clausewitz's On War.
Ah,
Yeah, that one, and we're going to try to unpack a chapter called Methodicism.
Clausewitz, he was a Prussian general, back in the 19th century, saw a lot of action.
Right, front row seat to some of the biggest conflicts of that time.
Exactly. And he really struggled with how to make sense of warfare, right? I mean, how do you impose order on something that's inherently chaotic?
Yeah, it seems like trying to nail jelly to a wall.
And that's really what this chapter is all about. How clinging too tightly to our playbooks, to our methods, can actually backfire in the real world of the battlefield.
So are you saying we shouldn't have a plan?
No, not at all. It's more nuanced than that. He uses some very specific military terms, and they might seem a bit dense at first. Words like law, principle, rules, and then, of course, methods themselves.
Okay, yeah, those are sometimes used interchangeably, but he's making a distinction here.
He is. Clausewitz connects them very deliberately to how military leaders at all levels, I mean, from the generals making those big strategic decisions down to, platoon leaders in the heat of the moment, how they make choices when lives are on the line.
So we're not just talking theory here. We're talking about the practical application of these concepts in the real world when it really matters.
Exactly. And to do that, he lays out this kind of hierarchy, a way of understanding how these ideas all relate to each other when you bring in the messy reality of war.
Okay, so let's break down that hierarchy. Where does he even start?
He starts with law, this idea of fixed, unbreakable rules. But in the context of war, he says, laws are just too rigid.
I'm with him so far. War is, well, it's dynamic, ever-changing.
And trying to apply these fixed rules, these laws, to that kind of fluid situation, it's a recipe for disaster.
Like trying to drive on a highway using the rules of, I don't know, some children's board game.
Yeah. And that's where he brings in principles. Think of them more as broad guidelines, like always protect your flanks, maintain those clear lines of communication, this kind of thing.
So they provide direction, but not a turn by turn.
Right. They don't dictate a specific course of action for every single scenario that might pop up.
It's less about this rigid set of rules then, and more about understanding these sort of overarching principles, these principles that should guide your actions, but not necessarily dictate every single one.
Exactly. They're like a compass, right? It gives you a bearing, but you have to adjust your course depending on, I don't know, the weather, the terrain.
Makes sense. Okay, so we've got laws at the very top, too rigid for this. Then principles, which are more like our guiding stars. What comes next in Clausewitz's hierarchy? What's below principles?
Below principles, you've got rules. And these are more like situational truths, things we learn from experience, things that tend to hold true on the battlefield, but that we should never take as, gospel truth.
No rule without exception, as they say.
Exactly. And then this is where it gets even more specific. Then you have directions and instructions. These are the concrete actions for very particular situations.
So that's getting down to the nitty-gritty, the direct orders.
Right. Think of it like the difference between a general outlining the objective for a whole campaign versus, a squad leader giving very specific orders during a firefight.
Right, exactly. Different levels of decision-making, different levels of specificity. So where do methods themselves fit into this whole thing? Clausewitz, he sees them as these recurring procedures, almost like default settings that we fall back on. And Methodicism, well, that's where the danger comes in.
Okay, so it's not that having methods is bad in and of itself. It's more that we can become too reliant on them. We fail to adapt, and then, bam, things fall apart.
Exactly. Methodicism can be dangerous because it often relies on, the average probability of events, like assuming the next battle is going to look just like the last one. And on the battlefield, well, that kind of thinking gets people killed. Yeah, because the enemy has a vote, right? No plan survives contact with the enemy perfectly intact. So how does Clausewitz illustrate this point? I know he uses some pretty compelling examples from military history.
He does. He talks about Frederick the Great.
The Prussian king, considered a military genius in his time.
Right, Frederick the Great. And his generals were masters of this tactic called the oblique order. Basically, it's concentrating your forces on one flank of the enemy to try and achieve a decisive breakthrough.
And this worked incredibly well for them in many battles, But then,
But then things changed. During the Napoleonic Wars, the Prussians, they found themselves up against this whole new kind of enemy in Napoleon
Napoleon, who had studied Frederick's methods, knew their strengths and weaknesses.
and was able to anticipate and counter their every move. The Prussians, they were stuck in their old ways. They suffered some pretty crushing defeats.
Like at the Battle of Jena in 1806, if I remember correctly. The Prussians were totally outmaneuvered by Napoleon. It's a stark reminder that what works in one context against one enemy can become a fatal flaw when the situation changes.
Absolutely. And you see this pattern, throughout military history. Whenever an army, a military force, becomes too wedded to one particular doctrine, one way of fighting, a new enemy, new technology, it can all render those methods useless, obsolete.
It's interesting, though, because Clausewitz isn't saying that all methods are bad, right? He draws a distinction, doesn't he?
He does. He recognizes that you need methods for training, for equipping your troops, for instilling discipline, making sure that everyone's more or less on the same page. But he sees the danger when those methods become these rigid plans, plans that can't adapt when the enemy does something unexpected or the situation changes on a dime.
So it's like you can practice that same drill over and over again, but you can't expect it to play out exactly the same way when you're on a live fire exercise.
Exactly. Drill those basic movements, those standard procedures until they're second nature. Absolutely. But the moment the enemy throws a curveball, you need to be ready to adapt. Those pre-programmed responses, they might not be enough. That's when adaptability, that ability to think on your feet and make adjustments in real time, that's what becomes crucial.
Okay, so let's bring this into the 21st century, because Clausewitz, he was writing back in the 19th century. So how do these ideas about Methodicism apply to modern warfare? Where, I mean, everything's faster, the technology is constantly evolving, and you've got entirely new domains of conflict like cyberspace. It almost seems like it would be even more dangerous to get stuck in your ways in the modern world.
You're absolutely right. And that's what makes Clausewitz so relevant, even all these centuries later. His ideas, they transcend muskets and cannons. Because what he's really writing about is the human element of warfare. How we as human beings make decisions under pressure with imperfect information in this chaotic, ever-changing environment.
So it's less about the specific weapons, the technologies, and more about these underlying, I don't know, almost mental models, the way that we make decisions in the context of any kind of conflict.
Precisely. And you can see these principles play out in modern warfare, even today. Take, for instance, drone warfare.
Which has become a major, major part of modern military operations.
Right. Drones, they provide a level of intelligence gathering and strike capability that, frankly, Clausewitz couldn't have even imagined.
Oh, absolutely. It would have seemed like magic back then.
Right. But imagine a scenario where a military, they become completely reliant on drones. They're using them for everything, from recon to airstrikes. They develop these very specific methods for employing them. And initially, sure, it works. They're achieving their objective, maybe even minimizing casualties. But then the enemy adapts.
Start to figure out ways to jam communication signals or develop new camouflage techniques.
Exactly. Things designed specifically to throw off those drones.
And what happens to the force that's become overly reliant on those drone-centric methods?
They're left scrambling, trying to catch up.
Right.
Because they've become so used to this one tool, this one specific way of waging war, that they haven't developed the flexibility, the creativity even, to adapt when those methods stop working.
It's like they've become a hammer, and every problem looks like a nail.
Right. That's a great analogy. And we see this in other areas of modern warfare, too. Take cyber warfare, for example. Let's say you develop this really sophisticated cyber attack, a way of disrupting the enemy's networks, infiltrating their command and control systems. But you become overly reliant on that one trick, that one method. The enemy beefs up their defenses, develops countermeasures, and suddenly you're vulnerable.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap of Methodicism? If Clausewitz was right, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution, no magic formula for winning wars, what are we left with? So where do we even begin? I mean, we can't exactly program soldiers with algorithms for every possible scenario out there, especially not with the pace of modern warfare, right?
Right, and that's where, Clausewitz's emphasis on human judgment comes in. He was a big believer in this idea of, I think they call it coup d'oeil. It's that almost instinctive ability to read the battlefield, size up your opponent, make the right call under pressure.
I mean, like intuition, gut feeling, that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. But those are pretty hard things to, teach.
Yeah, you can't exactly quantify those.
And that's where his hierarchy of concepts, it all comes back around to that. Think about it. You can drill those, lower level methods, those specific procedures, until they're like second nature.
Right.
But as you move up that chain of command, as the decisions you're making have, well, bigger and longer lasting impact, it becomes less about rote memorization and more about making judgment calls based on those higher level principles we were talking about earlier.
So it's like recognizing that those specific methods, those tools in the toolbox, they're really only effective within a certain set of, parameters. But the principles, those broader guidelines, those are what give you the ability to be flexible, to adapt when the situation calls for it.
Exactly. You've got to develop those mental models. You have to be able to look at a situation and understand not just what's happening, but why it's happening. What's the other guy thinking? What are they trying to achieve? How can I, counter their moves? And
Hmm.
that way of thinking, that's something you can hone through things like wargaming, scenario planning, even, I'd argue, historical study.
It's about training your mind to expect the unexpected, to think about how your adversary might try to, I don't know, outmaneuver you.
Yeah, so you're never caught totally flat-footed. It's about building that mental agility, that capacity for adaptation that Clausewitz knew was so essential.
And it's not even just about adapting to the enemy, is it? It's about being willing to adapt your own thinking.
Right.
Challenge your own assumptions.
Yeah.
Recognize when your own methods, they become outdated, predictable even.
Absolutely. You got to have the humility to admit when you might be wrong. Question the things that have, always worked in the past. Be open to new ideas, new ways of approaching those problems.
Which is tough,
Yeah,
especially, I imagine, for folks who've had a lot of success doing things a certain way.
it is. But in a way, it's a constant process, right? Learning, adapting, evolving, and never, ever underestimating that human element.
Both in your opponent and yourself.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The moment we forget that war is, at its core, a human endeavor, that's the moment we become predictable. And that's the moment we become vulnerable.
That's something for all of us to think about. And not even just in, a military context, but really in any field.
Absolutely. So, listener, here's a question for you. When have you seen this methodicism in your own life? Has it led to victory? Defeat? Think about it. Talk about it. And until next time, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.